A few episodes ago, I explained how the switch from number 19 and number 20 to number 16, number 17, and number 18 was due to, well, not so much editorial influence as former editorial influence. Specifically, Toriyama's editor from Dr. Slump until the beginning of the Saiyan arc, Torishima Kazuhiko, had called Toriyama up to say, "The enemies are just a geezer and a fatso, change it!" As such, Toriyama hastily and without regard to previous continuity, added in the new villains. Well, guess what? Upon seeing them, Torishima called up again, this time to say, "What, now it's just a couple of brats?" And that's how we ended up with Cell. I called the previous villain switch up a soft reboot due to it resetting the conflict without significantly wiping continuity. However, I think it's fair to call this switch an even softer reboot. Like the previous example, the old bad guys are replaced with a new bad guy, but in this case it's handled significantly differently. Rather than disposing of the old bad guys are incorporated into the new plot through the mechanic of Cell needing to absorb number 17 and number 18 to become complete. I don't think Toriyama really had much of a choice. He'd already killed off one set of baddies. Pulling that once is an exciting twist. Pulling it twice would have been tedious and redundant and, quite frankly, somewhat comical. Instead, it feels fresh because each one is doing something different. Again, we don't really know what pull Torishima had over Toriyama at this point, if any, but I do find it very impressive that Toriyama was able to incorporate number 17 and number 18 in a different way, rather than just abandoning them entirely. Perhaps the only real letdown is that it results in the road trip trio not feeling fully realized. Maybe a lot more could have been done with number 19 and number 20, particularly number 20 since it was his revenge in the first place, but at least their role in the story was definitively capped. They fight, they die, they serve as a shocking twist that things aren't as easy as they seemed. Nothing feels incomplete about them the way their story ended up. But I can't quite say the same about this. While their new role falls into place relatively seamlessly, their old roles end up feeling a bit half-baked, as they ultimately do very little. When I made the remark about there being no payoff to number 17 wondering why Dr. Gero went back to cyborgs when he could make fully mechanical artificial humans, several people rebutted that the line was meant to set up Cell, as in, Dr. Gero had devised a bio-warrior and went back to cyborgs so Cell could use them as an upgrade. It is certainly possible that that is what the line was intended to mean. However, the production timeline makes that a little difficult, I feel. The new enemies had only been introduced 2 chapters before this line was said. Presumably, Torishima only saw the completed chapter after it was released like everyone else. Toriyama would almost certainly have finished the next chapter, and possibly even the next one, by the time Torishima recommended he change the villains. I suppose it's not impossible Toriyama could have changed or added that one panel to foreshadow Cell, but does that mean that number 16 wasn't originally intended to be fully mechanical? Or he was, and it was just a coincidence that allowed the line to work in that context? See what I mean? I don't know for sure. But it seems to me like there were too many elements already being set up with too slim a time frame for them to be explained away by Cell. But, if it wasn't meant for that purpose and actually was supposed to be hinting at a secret about number 16, I do have to admit the line fits seamlessly into the new context of hinting at number 17 and number 18 being designed for Cell. But that also raises another question. Why? What logic is there in Dr. Gero creating this perfect killing machine, only to put the components it requires to become complete, whatever they are, in 2 sentient beings with established obedience problems? Why not simply incorporate those components into Cell in the first place? The guy already has to wait an entire generation for this thing to become mature, so why further complicate matters with a fetch quest? If he initially devised those components for number 17 and number 18, only to realize they'd work well in Cell, why not make more and incorporate them into Cell's design? Maybe for whatever reason, the embryonic Cell just can't synthesize the components, not that that's ever said or implied. So why not duplicate the parts and leave them in the lab, where Cell can easily acquire them as soon as he's grown? Don't tell me number 17 and number 18 are basically organ incubators. If Dr. Garo can create a whole person in a vat of goo, I find it hard to believe he couldn't suspend those parts the same way. But for the sake of argument, let's say that's true. They can't be put in Cell initially, they are absolutely one of a kind and can't be reproduced. And number 17 and number 18 have to carry them in their bodies, or else the parts will wither away and die. If all that's true, why store them in beings that are going to be sent out for combat and could possibly be destroyed, which is exactly what happens? I mean, Cell had to stumble upon a method of time traveling into a parallel reality just to get a shot at finding those components. And why put them in beings who were initially stronger than Cell and could destroy him if he comes across them too quickly? If this is some kind of personal quest of achievement and growth that Cell must undertake, well, there's absolutely no evidence of that in the story. Not to mention that's usually something a morally balanced scientist does, someone who treats his creation as his child, not someone jonesing for revenge who treats his creation as a weapon. And as for the former example, you'd hope it wouldn't involve killing two of his other children to do so. So why is all this the way it is? As I've already implied, the details are never elaborated on, but it's obviously just to be able to keep number 17 and number 18 in the story. And while I'm on the subject, that further raises the question of why does Cell have Ki while the other artificial humans don't? I mean, it's obvious why Cell has Ki. It's for that shocking moment when the heroes can sense all these other characters coming from him. But as I already said, I like the idea of the villains not having Ki. It knocks the heroes off balance, and it makes sense when they're a bunch of robots. I'd even accept Mr. Brain in a Jar not having Ki. But as we'll learn in just a couple of chapters, number 17 and number 18 are almost entirely organic with only a few mechanical parts, which is the whole reason Cell, a completely artificially grown being who does possess Ki, can absorb them. All living things have this spiritual energy. Number 17 and number 18 are created from human bases. Beyond this arc, we'll find out they are so organic they can both create offspring with fully human Earthlings. And yet, they don't have Ki, but Cell does. Something, infinite energy reactor, I guess. The need to absorb number 17 and number 18 to become perfect gives Cell a specific and strong motivation with a step-by-step course to achieving it. It's not the typical take over the world kind of thing, which is nice. Even the whole immortality shtick, which drove the motivations of the villains of the last two arcs, seems abstract at best by comparison. I find Cell's goal pushes him in interesting directions and likewise forces the heroes to have to react in specific ways. While Cell is terrorizing people just like other Dragon Ball villains have, it's a more animalistic type of terrorizing. He's not hurting people for the sake of sadism or fulfilling some sort of concept of evil. He's doing it to feed on them, because he has to become powerful enough to fend off the Dragon Team, and of course, become strong enough to rival number 17 and number 18. So Cell certainly has a lot going for him at this point in the series. He's a guy who knows what he wants, knows what he needs, and has a list of achievable goals. And what stage of his plan he has reached determines what the Dragon Team has to do to stop him. Of course, this also implies quite heavily that Cell, like Frieza before him, will be another transforming villain. To me, that's a bit of a letdown to do that again when the last arc so heavily relied on it. And it's especially problematic now that it's become such a strong component of the science development as well, and is about to become even more so. It also pretty easily telegraphs that the heroes are not going to be able to stop Cell from doing what he wants. There would be no point in setting this up if Cell wasn't going to ultimately get what he desires. Unless Toriyama was compelled to trade out villains a third time. And while I do feel that more needed to be done with our characters to make them look a bit more competent, I don't think them being doomed to fail is necessarily a negative. There are certain expectations of the genre, and following those expectations to make a satisfying story isn't a bad thing. It's the journey that ultimately makes or breaks the audience's ability to accept it, and we'll be getting more into that journey next time. However, I can say I vastly prefer Cell's method of transforming over Frieza's. If you remember, one of the things I complained about most in the Frieza arc was how Frieza's ability to transform at will rendered his in-between forms completely pointless. But Cell can't do that. He can only successfully transform through outside means. Because of that, his opponents, theoretically, have a degree of control over Cell's effectiveness. Likewise, Cell's middle form serves as a necessary step and advantage in his growth, as opposed to just him holding back his power. And that's why I find Vegeta telling Frieza to transform a completely different animal than what he's going to do in regards to Cell. It should also be mentioned that Cell's ability to transform was apparently an editorial mandate. From Toriyama, I liked number 19 and number 20 just fine, and I liked the initial Cell fine as well, but Kondo-san said, "He looks ugly. Of course, he can transform," so I had no choice but to transform him into his second form. Now, Kondo Yu was actually Toriyama's editor at this time. This was no longer a case of his former editor coming around and giving his opinion. This was Toriyama's direct superior telling him this, as if the poor guy hadn't been ping-ponged enough. Honestly, I can't help but imagine that Kondo was getting tired of his predecessor skulking around behind his back, and just started throwing his weight around too to say, "Hey, I'm in charge here and I can make Toriyama do things too." However, what exactly that meant is never elaborated on. Does that mean that Toriyama designed Cell without the intention of having him absorb number 17 and number 18? If so, I have to applaud Kondo for, perhaps inadvertently, giving Cell such a defined motive for his actions, even if I'm not a fan of more transformations. Or does it mean that Cell would have absorbed them, but it wouldn't have resulted in a change of appearance, just like how his absorption of other people didn't result in a physical change? Or does it mean that Toriyama already knew damn well he was going to do that, but just shrugged and said, "You're the boss," to make Kondo feel better? Whatever the case, Cell's trajectory meant transforming. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. This will be the last regular installment of Dragon Ball Dissection for the year. Which means the next time will be the start of Dragon Ball Dissection December, the annual Dragon Ball Dissection month-long marathon. Let me give you the rundown for this year. December 4th, the Cell Arc Part 10. December 11th, the Cell Arc Part 11. December 18th, Dragon Ball Z Movie 7. Christmas Day, the Cell Arc Part 12. And New Year's Eve we conclude with the Trunks Special. In the meantime, stay tuned for the long-awaited continuation of Batman. Yes, it's really coming this time. Happy December!